Today we're going to be making this adorable little cooking pot from the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom game, complete with little wood logs and LED flames. We'll also be making some ingredients for my Link and Senshi figures to start cooking with together. As this was initially Senshi's idea to begin with, I'll make sure the cooking pot is scaled to his exact specifications. But before that, let's just take a moment to appreciate how pretty he is. Jeez, I love him so much. Based on my reference photos and Senshi's height, I'm gonna make the stand for the cooking pot about this tall. And because Senshi wouldn't have it any other way, I make sure the stand will also fit the cooking pot I made for him in a previous video, by tracing what will be the outer edge ring of the pot stand. Then I explore my own art dungeon for an embarrassingly long time, in pursuit of literally anything else that's circular that I could use to trace the inside edge of the ring. But after 10 straight minutes of searching, my hard work finally pays off. With my newfound legendary template in hand, I finish drawing the inside edge, as well as the leg template I'll need soon, and begin cutting. After rolling out a sheet of my extra firm cosplay, I press my leg template into it 5 times, so that I know where to cut after baking the sheet. I do the same for the pot holder ring, cut it into an essentially flawless stop sign, and then with just a touch of dungeon magic, I shape-shift it from a stop sign into a fastener nut in order to save some of the excess clay for later. As I always do after baking, I give my legs a good slap and twist, and then I trim them out with an X-Acto knife. After a stern look from Senshi, I also reluctantly trim the fastener nut ring into a more traditional pot holding ring using my tiny scissors, and then cut the ring in half to better trim it to its final shape. After staring at Link's pot's holders legs for a few minutes, I decided that my 1-2-3 blocks would be the best way to hold everything together while assembling and baking this thing. I attach a little block of raw clay to my semi-ring to keep it from sagging, and then add 2 little dots of glue where it'll attach to these legs. For the second half of the ring, I glue it on in a similar fashion with emotional support from Senshi and physical support from my 1-2-3 blocks. Then I trim some little grooves into the ring to wedge in the 2 remaining pot holder legs, glue them on, and bake them into an unintentional crosshair pattern. For my flames, since I don't want to have to deal with a bunch of wires or actual fire, I'm going to use these wireless LEDs that are powered by this delicious induction circle here. Scientifically speaking, it's actually pretty simple. As Marcel once explained, you place the LEDs within the magic circle and then they light up. For the clay flame caps I'll be making to diffuse my flame LEDs to look more flamey, I'm going to use the end of this tool since it happens to be essentially the same dimensions as my lights. Since I still haven't bought any translucent cosclay, I'm using some of my blue glow cosclay for this, and I just hand mold the clay until I've got a nice fiery shape going. Immediately after baking it, I remove my first flame from its mold and check to see if my magic lights fit. And they do. And better yet, I can remove them too. With the first 3 done, we slide the results into our magic circle for extra motivation to continue. And lastly, I dry brush the flame caps yellow to better sell the fiery effect to the camera. Now onto the stone cooking pot. I use the top half of a blank wooden nesting doll as my mold. I drape a sheet of my extra firm cosclay across the top of it, trim it, and smooth it out with some mineral oil. After baking, I use a pencil to very non-scientifically mark off where I should trim the pot and resume cutting. Once the edges have been meticulously trimmed and sanded, I realize they're still way too rough, so I apply some translucent liquid clay to the edge and boom, we have a pot. Then my pot gets some chunky little handles that I smooth in with my silicone pointy tool, and then de-chunkify after baking. Since I didn't smooth them in on the top side, I add some clay adhesive and raw gray clay on top to blend them in with the rest of the pot. As fun as it is to make wood out of clay, I have recently discovered another incredible material I can make the pot's wood from. Wood! My mother always said, nothing cuts wood better than cheap, worn-down kitchen knives. So I push my pristine miter saw out of the way and begin my cut with an ancient family heirloom. Now close your eyes for a sec, Mom. And open. Never throw away your cutlery, guys. Next, I wedge my non-wood clay blade into my non-clay wood log and use the bottom of my miter saw as a hammer to chop up my mini firewood. Another job well done. After spending over 20 minutes deciding how I want to arrange the wood pieces and flame pieces, I realize I need to glue it all down because it would be a huge pain to rearrange it all every single time I want to photograph it. So I start off by clay gluing some baked clay rectangles to the bottom of the stand to make it easier to arrange the wood and flames in a pretty way. After baking the pot stand, I give it a layer of gunmetal acrylic paint and a brighter gunmetal acrylic dry brushing. My pot then gets a coat of gray acrylic paint, which has a bit of honey brown mixed in to give it a more natural look, followed by a dry brushing of lighter gray mixed with a bit of yellow, and a final dry brushing of even lighter gray. And since I don't think I've ever seen Link wash any of his camping supplies, I add some watered down brown paint for a touch of weathered realism. For my first few wood pieces, I decide I want to use clay glue on them and bake them onto the pot holder base. Speaking of which, mid-baking is the best time to check if the metallic acrylic paints you used are oven safe. So I take full advantage of the opportunity and learn they might not be. So for the rest of my wood, I decide an even better glue than clay glue would be wood glue. I top off Link's cooking pot with some matte acrylic varnish, and now it's time to move on to our cooking ingredients. Senshi's first recommendation was tomatoes, so I start off by rolling out some tiny tomato vine candidates. This can be a little tricky sometimes with cos clay specifically, since it's stickier than regular polymer clay. If you roll out thin noodles like this and they start getting too long and thin, they end up getting really unruly and raveling. After baking, I trim and clay glue my tomato vines together. As for my tomato leaves, I wrap some of the same green clay around one of my smaller ballpoint tools, catch a glimpse of my reference images, and realize my vines aren't properly scaled to my cooking pot at all. So I ADHD-ly stop everything I'm doing, cut down and rearrange the side vines to better fit the cooking pot, and totally forget about the leaves entirely. Then after baking it again, I realize the size is right, but the shape is miserable. So I remake the vines completely with some curved noodles instead. And now we're back in business. Tomato business. First, I use some Sculpey clay to make a general tomato-y shape, and add the little vine holes with my silicone pointy tool, and then attach it to the vine. Rinsing and repeating, I make 4 more pretty tomatoes and 3 more test subject tomatoes. And this brings us to my favorite part, painting them all. I start by giving them all a yellowish green base coat, and then progressively add more orange and red as I work my way up to the tastier looking tomatoes. Oh right, the leaves. Having totally not forgotten about them, I trim my tomato leaves from their semi-sphere molds and begin sticking them on one by one with some clay glue. Then, after a quick paint touch-up, I finish them with some satin acrylic varnish. Man, they're looking so good, I can almost smell them. Oh, of course, that's the smell of my ravioli, actually. It's a good thing I ate before this next build, because making this silly wheat nearly broke me. Similar to my tomatoes, I start by making a few wheat stem candidates out of cos clay. For my grains of wheat, I trim a bunch of little leafy shapes out of a sheet of cos clay, glue them onto my wheat stem, and make a silicone mold for this first wheat stalk. After spending way too much time making 5 of these wheat stalks from my template and painstakingly cleaning them up one by one, I come to realize I actually hate them. So I make a less fern-like and more wheat-like template from scratch. This time I make the grains individually from raw bits of clay so that they're more rounded and less leaf-like. Then, while meticulously cleaning up my final wheat template, I break off some of the pieces on accident. And of course, glue them back on in the wrong order, so it doesn't look quite right. But maybe this is right, and real wheat is wrong. Let's go with that. After making a few wheat babies from my realer than real second wheat mold, I stack them together to see how I'll bundle them up. And at this point, I realize I need to add a longer stem to the front one so that I can stack them in a pretty way. Pretty wheats also need pretty skirts. So I add a sheet of cos clay for the skirt, bake it, and get started on the skirt rope. This string I want to use is too thick though, so I peel it apart to get a more miniature-friendly thickness. I coat it in some tacky glue and wrap it around the wheat skirt. After letting that dry for a bit, I peel it off and start painting my wheat a delicious honey brown. I then dry brush it a lighter honey brown, paint the skirt with my leftover mushroom maroon paint, and paint the rope with a teeny dot of my leftover mushroom blue paint, being extra careful not to waste even a tiny bit on my fingers. To bring out some of the line details of the wheat, I finish it off with some watered down brown acrylic paint. Pledging never to tolerate gluten again, I get started on our last ingredient, Hateno cheese. I use a mix of white and yellow Sculpey clay for this, and hand shape it into a cheese wheel. Then I flatten it out a bit with an old plastic lid and bake it for 30 minutes, since it only needs one baking. I sand it to clean up its shape and remove some of the dust embedded in the clay. Then I mark off with a pencil where my clay wedges will be. And I use my bigger, sharper, way less damaged clay blade to hopefully get some nice clean cuts. Even after all that, my cheese wedges are still a little rougher than I'd like, but I can clean most of that up with some sanding. And one of the great things about Sculpey clay is that it's very easy to sand, unlike cause clay, which is a bit more rubbery after baking, making it feel like you're sanding an eraser instead. With all my wedges sanded, I use some masking tape to puzzle them back into their cheese wheel shape. I also add some tape to the bottom to hold them all together better. The cheese holes then get penciled in, and all that's left is to Dremel out the cheese holes. I take back what I said about my favorite part being the tomato painting. This is actually my favorite part. For the smaller cheese holes, I also use a round metal file to clean up the Dremeled holes. The insides of the wedges also get some holes, mostly because I really like making holes in this stuff, but also because it helps add to the realism too. After some more sanding and a little bubble bath, they're starting to look like delicious Swiss cheese. While I'm waiting to start painting the outer edges of my wedges, I trim some masking tape to put around each cheese shape, before gently applying some yellow acrylic paint to them. After letting the paint dry for a few minutes, I peel off the tape, and of course some of the clay comes off with it. So I question what I'm doing with my life, clean up the painted edges with an X-Acto knife, coat my remaining slices with some translucent clay, all to try to stop the paint from peeling away. And it works surprisingly well. These two wedges in my left hand are coated in translucent clay, while this one in my right hand isn't. The translucent clay also gives them a more cheesy sheen too, which is a nice bonus. For the final cheese wedge detailing, I add some washi tape to the edge as a guideline. And then I use a thin brown pen to draw some decorations on the cheese rinds. And finally, after coating my 4 best cheeses with some satin acrylic varnish, it's time for our photo shoot. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.